The Foreword of Mormonism and Masonry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Mormonism and Masonry by Samuel Goodwin. The Foreword. This pamphlet is published on the recommendation of the Grand Lodge Committee on Masonic Education and Instruction, and with the approval of the Grand Master. The general interest in the subject under consideration, its practical bearing, and the fact that nothing has been put in print in recent years which would serve as a guide to those who seek information are responsible for the decision to publish. The fact that Latter-day Saints are not received into Masonic lodges in Utah, either as visitors or members, is of course known throughout the jurisdiction, and to some extent outside of it. Why this is so, it is not so well known. While no claim is made that the subject is here treated exhaustively, the writer at least believes that facts are here assembled which are suggestive of an answer to the query why, and that they are worthy of consideration. Readers are particularly referred to pages 39 to 45, inclusive, under the caption Reference and Notes. Some additional and interesting material is to be found there. The first 3 chapters were printed in the February and March issues of the Builder of the current year. The remaining portion has not before been in type. SHG, initials for Samuel H. Goodwin. Salt Lake City, Utah, August 15, 1921. End of The Foreword. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 1 of Mormonism and Masonry by Samuel Goodwin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Historical. Early contact of Mormonism with Masonry. Nauvoo period. In the latter part of April, 1839, the first steps were taken toward the establishment, in Illinois, of a semi-theocratic community under the leadership of Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet. Similar attempts had been made by this teacher of a new faith at Kirtland, Ohio, and at several points in the state of Missouri, all of which had come to a disastrous conclusion. The why of these failures does not lie within the province of these chapters. On the date named, certain of the Mormon leaders came up from Quincy, some 50 miles down the Mississippi River, whither they had fled from their troubles in Missouri, and definitely fixed upon a location for a new settlement. The site of this new Zion included the straggling village of Commerce. On the 1st of May, the initial purchase of land was made by a committee headed by Joseph Smith. Soon other extensive holdings were secured, and a year later, when a post office was established there, the Postmaster General rechristened the place Nauvoo in deference to the wishes of the settlers. To this place the saints gathered in large numbers, coming especially from Missouri, where multiplied troubles had beset them. In consequence of this movement, Nauvoo experienced a phenomenal growth from those times. Within 2 years from the time the first land was secured by Joseph Smith, the population had grown from almost nothing to more than 3,000, and when Grand Master Jonas instituted Nauvoo Lodge, March 15, 1842, between 8 and 10,000 people made their homes there. 3 years later, Nauvoo enjoyed the distinction of being the largest city in the state of Illinois, and, with the exception of St. Louis, it had no rival in the Northwest. These people came originally from the older sections of the country, and from foreign lands, more particularly from England, and were largely the fruits of the aggressive missionary policy which had distinguished this church from its inception. Among those who were attracted by the proclamations of this new evangel were a number who were or had been members of the Masonic fraternity. Prominent among these were Dr. John C. Bennett, an Ohio Mason; Heber C. Kimball, one of the first apostles and a trusted friend of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, who had received the degree in Victor, New York; and Hiram Smith, the prophet's brother, who was also a New York Mason. Early in the summer of 1841, these Masons addressed a communication to Bodley Lodge No. 1, located at Quincy, in which they asked for the usual recommendation in order that they might establish a new lodge at Nauvoo. This request was denied, the reason assigned by Bodley Lodge being that, As these persons are unknown to this lodge as Masons, it was thought prudent not to do so. A recent writer informs us that not only was the recommendation withheld, but also that Bodley Lodge protested against the granting of a dispensation to the Nauvoo brethren. However that may be, on October 15, 1841, 10 days after the close of Grand Lodge, Grand Master Jonas issued his dispensation authoring a lodge at Nauvoo, and 5 months later, March 15, 1842, he paid an official visit to that place and set the lodge to work. In this connection it may not be amiss to note the fact in passing that the Grand Lodge of Illinois was barely 1 year old when the Nauvoo dispensation was issued, and that there were few, if any, over 100 members in the constituent lodges of the state. The natural desire for increase of numbers may have had something to do in determining the action of Grand Master Jonas in this case. From the very first, the movement to establish a Masonic lodge in Nauvoo appears to have been regarded with suspicion and distrust by Masons elsewhere in the state, more particularly by the members of Bodley Lodge No. 1 at Quincy. This attitude may have been due in part, at least, to the tales and rumors of misdoings which had followed the Mormons from Ohio and Missouri. But there were other factors. The history of the period now under review points unmistakably to certain political, religious, social, and personal forces and considerations which were not without a positive and a very great influence on the character and fortunes of the Mormon lodges, and which did much to shape Masonic opinion concerning those lodges and their membership. At the risk of a seeming digression, space must be given here to a consideration of some of these elements of the situation, for otherwise we shall find ourselves without either clue or background. Among the sinister forces of the time which reacted unfavorably, politics played no inconspicuous part. With the rapid increase of population at the Mormon center came a realization, on the part of the politicians of the state, that the Mormon vote was a factor that must be reckoned with. And the concern of the leaders of the two political parties was in no way lessened when they discovered the fact that for all practical purposes the leaders of the church could turn the Mormon vote to the one party or the other as their plans or needs might dictate. If there lingered any doubt on this score in the minds of any, it must have been set at rest when the prophet unequivocally declared that he and his people would support the men and party who were friendlier to their interests. As a result, both Whigs and Democrats sought by acts of kindness and promises of help to win the support. Nor were the leaders of these religionists slow in making use of their power. At the General Conference of the Church held early in October 1840, it was decided to petition the state legislature to incorporate the town of Nauvoo, and a committee of 3, including Joseph Smith and Dr. John C. Bennett, were selected to draft the necessary petition and bill. These documents were taken to Springfield by Bennett, who appears to have been a shrewd lobbyist, in December of that year. When presented, the bill seems to have met no opposition. It passed the lower house with only 1 or 2 dissenting votes, and the Senate with none at all. Indeed, we are informed by a recent writer that in the House of Representatives the bill was not even read, except by title. Yet there were in the Assembly at the time such men of later national prominence as John A. Logan, Lyman Trumbull, and Abraham Lincoln, and Stephen A. Douglas, then Secretary of State of Illinois and leader of the Democratic party, used his influence to expedite the passage of the bill. The act granting the charter to Nauvoo was signed by Governor Carlin, December 6, 1840. This charter, which includes charters for the Nauvoo Legion and the University of the city of Nauvoo, was of a most extraordinary character. The only restrictions placed on the city council was that no law should be passed which was repugnant to the Constitution of the United States or the Constitution of the state. Among other usual powers granted by this remarkable instrument was that of issuing writs of habeas corpus by the municipal court. This feature, as the sequel shows, was a dangerous provision. It was so liable to abuse, and it was abused. It was the misuse of such writs that brought the city and state authorities into conflict, fed the fires of hatred and opposition, and furnished a pretext for mob action. About the time that the Nauvoo Masons were taking the initial steps in the organization of the lodge, Judge Stephen A. Douglas, then one of the justices of the state Supreme Court, and located at Quincy, visited Nauvoo, addressed the people, was entertained by Joseph Smith, and while there appointed Dr. John C. Bennett master in chancery. As noted above, Douglas had aided in securing the passage of the Act of Incorporation for Nauvoo, and had thereby won the gratitude of the saints. His action in the present instance increased the favor with which he was regarded by Joseph Smith and the people, but it brought upon him the unsparing criticism of his political opponents, and from this the people whom he had so signally favored did not entirely escape. Indeed, so caustic was the criticism leveled at Douglas by one paper, the Warsaw Signal, that Joseph Smith, in a vitriolic communication addressed to the editor of that paper, ordered his subscription cancelled. On another occasion, not long after the Nauvoo lodge had been set to work, Douglas adjourned court in order that he might visit Nauvoo and witness the review of the Nauvoo Legion. In connection with the elections of that fall, Joseph Smith published an article in which he declared that the Mormon people did not care a fig for Whig or Democrat, that they all looked alike, and that he would support those who had shown themselves to be friends of the Mormons, adding, "Douglas is a master spirit, and his friends are our friends. We are willing to cast our banners on the air and fight by his side." In the gubernatorial election which resulted in the choice of Thomas Ford for governor, the situation had become so tense that the opposing candidate, Joseph Duncan, felt justified in making opposition to the Mormons one of the chief planks of his platform. The curious, who may be desirous of seeing to what lengths politicians were willing to go in those days to secure support of the prophet and his followers, are referred to some of the speeches made before political conventions in Illinois during the early forties. Enough has been said above to indicate somewhat of the methods employed by the politicians of those days, and the sacrifices they were willing to make for party advantage. The effort to win the saints to support of one political party or the other continued to be a factor in their affairs as long as they remained in Nauvoo, and it was this rivalry to secure their political adherents that made it possible for them to obtain such unusual favors and to wield the influence they did in political affairs. And it was this rivalry that made them alternately courted and hated by those who would use them. Another factor, which at first blush might seem to be rather remote from the subject, but which none the less militated against the Masonry of Nauvoo, developed in the county to the south of that in which the city of the saints was located. Some time previous to the date upon which Grand Master Jonas issued his dispensation to the Nauvoo brethren, a campaign was begun to secure the removal of the county seat from Quincy to Columbus. Quincy was the home of Bodley Lodge, while Grand Master Jonas lived in Columbus. Naturally, the Grand Master was in favor of the proposed change, while quite as naturally the prospect of losing the county seat did not commend itself to the people of Quincy and the membership of the Masonic Lodge there. A good deal of bitterness was engendered as a result, and feeling ran so high that when the Grand Master sent communications to the Quincy papers in advocacy of the changes, those reflectors of public feeling and opinion refused to print them. Not to be baffled in his purpose to carry on the fight, Grand Master Jonas and some of his friends went to St. Louis, purchased the necessary printing outfit, shipped it to Columbus, and began the publication of the Columbus Advocate, the very name of which indicated the purpose for which it was established. While this furnished the Grand Master with a medium through which he might express his views, it did not tend to mollify the feelings of the people of Quincy. One result was, apparently, that the members of Bodley Lodge lost no opportunity to embarrass the Grand Master, and the Lodge minutes and the proceedings of Grand Lodge show how this situation reacted unfavorably on the Nauvoo lodges. But, while the machinations of slanderous politicians and the venom and ill feelings engendered in an extraneous squabble over a county seat were each influential in the affairs of Nauvoo and its Masonry, neither was as baleful in its effects or as portentous of evil for all concerned, as were certain events which even then were taking place within the community itself. Exactly 1 month previous to the visit of Judge Douglas to Nauvoo, when he appointed John C. Bennett Master in Chancery, viz., April 5, 1841, Joseph Smith took his first plural wife. While this, so far as the available records show, was the first instance of the practice of polygamy, or the great and glorious principle of plural marriages, the doctrine had been taught by Smith to certain of his followers fully 10 years earlier. According to the records, the principle was first impressed upon the mind of the prophet in 1831, and from the same sources we learn that immediately he made it known to a few of his close personal friends, that they in turn passed it on to certain others. Although the revelations on plural marriage, as it appears in Doctrines and Covenants, was committed to writing July 12th, 1843, at which time Joseph Smith had not less than 12 plural wives, and other leaders of the church had followed the prophet in this practice, it was not officially proclaimed as a doctrine of the church until some years subsequent to the settlement in Utah. A moment's digression at this point may be justified by the interesting fact that as late as 1865 Brigham Young, in conversation with a prominent visitor who was a political figure of national importance at the time, gave the impression that he was responsible for the revelation on plural marriage. As reported to the Journal of Schuyler Colfax, the president of the church declared that the revelation of the Doctrine and Covenants declared for monogamy, but that polygamy was a later revelation commanded by God to him and a few others, and permitted and advised to the rest of the church. It is a matter of record that Joseph Smith began teaching this principle actively, though with great caution, in the year following the settlement at Nauvoo. At first he confided it only to his closest friends and those in whom he had absolute confidence, and not to them until he had exacted the most solemn promise of secrecy, for it was not yet lawful to utter this teaching in the hearing of the multitude. He did, however, venture to test the feelings of the people concerning this doctrine some time prior to the return of the apostles from Europe, viz., before July 1st, 1841. On the occasion named, he preached a sermon on the restoration of all things, in which he strongly hinted that the patriarchal or plural order of marriage, as practiced by the ancients, would again be established. We learn that this statement created great excitement and consternation among those who heard the discourse, delivered at a morning service, so much so, in fact, that the prophet deemed it wisdom, in the afternoon, to modify his statement by saying that possibly the Spirit had made the time seem nearer than it really was, when such things would be restored. From the evidence at hand, it appears that while at this time, that is, during the first half of the year 1841, knowledge and acceptance of the doctrines of a plurality of wives were confined to the leaders and principal men in the church, and that not all of them had been enlightened on the subject, within 2 years information on the subject had been quite generally disseminated among the people. To believe that such a revolutionary practice could be taught and indulged in for any considerable length of time, and have a knowledge of the fact limited to those for whom it was intended, would place too great a tax upon our credulity, and would flatly contradict the teaching of experience concerning human nature. The presence of apostates in the community, and in adjoining settlements, some of whom had stood high in the councils of the church, would preclude the possibility of maintaining secrecy. Gradually, knowledge of what was going on in respect to plurality of wives percolated throughout the community, and was taken up and given trumpet voice by the enemies of the church. Here, too, the fact should be noted that while it appears to have been a matter of common belief that the leaders of the church were practicing polygamy, those same leaders did not hesitate to deny, directly and by implication, that such was the case. This conflict between the teaching and practices of Joseph Smith and others was used with effect by those who, for one reason or other, had entered the lists against the Mormons. When referring to this feature, a present-day historian and member of the church declared that wicked men took advantage of the situation and brought sorrow to the hearts of the innocent and reproach upon the church. A single incident that occurred but a few months before the prophet's death must suffice to illustrate what, not unfairly, might be characterized as double-dealing. It seems that an elder of the church who had been instructed in the doctrine of a plurality of wives had been sent up to Lapeer County, Michigan. Whatever the directions he may have received from the church authorities as to the use to be made of this teaching, his zeal appears to have outran his wisdom. He publicly proclaimed the principle, with the result that the greatest excitement ensued. Upon learning the facts, Joseph and Hiram Smith prepared and published the following in the church paper. Notice: as we have lately been credibly informed that an elder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, by the name of Hiram Brown, has been preaching polygamy and other false and corrupt doctrines in the county of Lapeer, state of Michigan. This is to notify him and the church in general that he has been cut off from the church for his iniquity, and he is further notified to appear at the special conference on the 6th of April next to answer to these charges. Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, presidents of said church. Yet at this time When this notice was published, the prophet was the husband of not less than 20 plural wives. It might be noted in passing that the matter of Elder Brown's delinquencies was only remotely hinted at by Joseph Smith at the April conference, and the people were told that if they expected that matters of a petty trivial character were to be considered, they were doomed to disappointment. Instances of denial that polygamy was either taught or practiced at Nauvoo or elsewhere occur not infrequently in the literature of the church, even some years after the death of the prophet. It appears, however, that such statements and even the paragraphs in Doctrine and Covenants which deal with monogamy are not to be regarded as denials of the principle by church authorities, but rather as an evasion to satisfy the popular clamor. Undoubtedly the disaffection of Dr. John C. Bennett, which occurred early in May 1842, had more to do with focusing attention upon the practice of polygamy by Joseph Smith and others than any other one event. It is immaterial for our purpose how this man is to be regarded. He appears to have been a very devil, or a gentleman and a scholar, according to the point of view of the writer. This much is beyond dispute. He told the truth and not wicked lies about Joseph, when he declared that the prophet taught doctrine in secret which he dare not make public, and that he preached one thing in public and practiced another in private. And further, that he stated facts when he declared in his book, The History of the Saints, that Joseph Smith at that time, 1842, had plural wives, including Louisa Beeman. It is equally beyond controversy that Bennett was in a position to greatly injure the prophet, and no less true that he used his power to the utmost. In fact, it has been asserted by a recent writer that more than any other influence or person, he was responsible for the downfall of the Mormon Church in Illinois. For something like a year and a half, Bennett had been in a position to know the inner counsels of the leaders of the church, for he was in fact one of those leaders. When he became a member of the church, he was a quartermaster general of the state of Illinois. He helped to draft the famous charters and the bill for the incorporation of Nauvoo, and himself carried them up to Springfield and urged the passage of the act. He had been the first mayor of Nauvoo under the new charter, was second in command of the Nauvoo Legion, was made master in chancery by Judge Stephen A. Douglas, and for a time occupied Sidney Rigdon's place as a member of the first presidency of the church. When the break came between Bennett and the prophet, the latter, fully appreciating the power of Bennett to do harm, immediately proceeded to forestall the use of that power as far as possible, and this in ways which must have been humiliating to Bennett almost beyond endurance. In return, Bennett used voice and pen most persistently and effectively against Joseph Smith and all the interests with which he was identified. That Smith was fully alive to the danger from this quarter, and that it was not imaginary, appears from the fact that at his suggestion a special conference assembled at Nauvoo in August 1842, for the purpose of calling a number of elders to go out in different directions and by their preaching deluge the states with a flood of truth, to allay the excitement which had been raised by the falsehoods put in circulation by John C. Bennett and others. Nearly 400 men volunteered to undertake this work. The prophet himself had been hiding for 3 weeks immediately preceding this conference, his whereabouts being unknown to his people, on account of Bennett's activities. From Smith's journal we learn that he had been in Nauvoo during the entire period. End of chapter 1. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 2 of Mormonism and Masonry by Samuel Goodwin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Historical concluded. The foregoing statement of facts will aid to an understanding of some of the conditions which existed in Nauvoo at the time of the planting of Masonry in that place, and suggests at least that perhaps the soil there was not the very best for the development of the principles of our art. And further, this recital leaves little room for doubt that the irregularities permitted in the lodge room and the contumacious treatment of the edicts and messengers of the Grand Master were not the only considerations, although they were quite sufficient in themselves, that had weight in determining the status of Freemasonry among the Latter-day Saints. We may now proceed with the story of the Nauvoo lodges. As noted above, Grand Master Abraham Jonas instituted Nauvoo Lodge, U.D.,
and set it to work March 15th, 1842. The circumstances attending this function, so far as they are matters of record, are most interesting. Upon his return home, the Grand Master wrote quite an extended account of the occasion under the caption Nauvoo and the Mormons, which was published in his paper, the Columbus Advocate. Among other things, he said, "While at Nauvoo, I had a fine opportunity of seeing the people in a body. There was a Masonic celebration, and the Grand Master of the State was present for the purpose of publicly installing the officers of a new lodge. An immense number of persons assembled on the occasion, variously estimated from 5 to 10,000 persons, and never in my life did I witness a better dressed or a more orderly and well behaved assemblage, not a drunken or disorderly person to be seen, and the display of taste and beauty among the females could not well be surpassed anywhere. During my stay of 3 days, I became well acquainted with their principal men, and more particularly with their prophet, the celebrated old Joe Smith. I found him hospitable, polite, well informed, and liberal. With Joseph Smith, the hospitality of whose house I kindly received, I was well pleased." From the journal of Joseph Smith himself, we get a little more intimate view of what actually took place. Unlike the Grand Master, he was not writing for the purpose of confounding his critics. Under date of Tuesday, March 15th, he wrote: "I officiated as Grand Chaplain at the installation of the Nauvoo Lodge of Freemasons, at the grove near the temple. Grand Master Jonas of Columbus being present, a large number of people assembled on the occasion. The day was exceedingly fine. All things were done in order. In the evening I received the first degree in Freemasonry in Nauvoo Lodge, assembled in my general business office." On the day following, March 16th, he wrote: "I was with the Masonic Lodge, and rose to the sublime degree." From one other source comes a little indirect light upon the events connected with the institution of Nauvoo Lodge. Not long after this lodge had been set to work, rumors became current of unusual proceedings therein, which seemed to set at defiance well known and established Masonic law and usage. These tales finally crystallized into assertion, and on the 16th of July following, Bodley Lodge at Quincy held a special meeting, called for the purpose of considering the matter and taking such action as the facts might seem to warrant. After discussion, the sentiment of the meeting took the form of resolution. One of these called upon Grand Master Jonas to suspend the dispensation of Nauvoo Lodge with the annual communication of Grand Lodge. Another throws a little light back upon the events connected with the institution of that lodge. This resolution reads: "Resolved, that Bodley Lodge No. 1 of Quincy request of the Grand Lodge of the State of Illinois that a committee be appointed at the next annual meeting of said lodge to make inquiry into the manner the officers of the Nauvoo Lodge U.D. were installed, and by what authority the Grand Master initiated, passed, and raised Messrs. Smith and Sidney Rigdon to the degree of entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason at one and the same time, and that the proceedings of the committee be reported for the benefit of this lodge." This resolution seems to show that Bodley Lodge was not pleased with the public installation of the officers of Nauvoo Lodge, at the grove near the temple, in the presence of a vast throng, and during which the Mormon prophet served as Grand Chaplain, though he was not at the time even a member of the Blue Lodge, and further, that Sidney Rigdon, as well as Joseph Smith, was made a Mason at sight. The fact might be noted in passing that presumably it was this unusual action of the Grand Master in behalf of the two church leaders that was in the mind of one of the present-day apostles of the Mormon Church when he wrote that great Masonic honors were conferred upon Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. Be this as it may, the action taken by Bodley Lodge had the desired effect, and on August 11th, less than 6 months after its institution, the Grand Master issued his order suspending the dispensation of Nauvoo Lodge until the annual communication of Grand Lodge. In this short period the lodge had initiated 286 candidates, of which number 256 had been raised. When the matter came before Grand Lodge, October 2nd, 1842, the Grand Master explained his actions in connection with Nauvoo Lodge, and submitted the correspondence in relation thereto. To the keen regret of the student of those events, no word appears of record which throws any light on the character of the explanation made. The matter was placed in the hands of the Committee on Returns and Work of the Lodges for consideration and recommendation. On the evening of the second day's session of Grand Lodge, this committee presented a divided report. The majority regretted that the lodge had disregarded the instructions of the Grand Master to set up the records of the lodge, but expressed the belief that probably the work done conformed to the requirements of Grand Lodge. However, evidence submitted seemed to show that the intention and ancient landmarks of our institution had been departed from, to an inexcusable extent, but that the actual situation could be ascertained only by an investigation of the proceedings and an inspection of the original records of the lodge. The committee therefore recommended that the dispensation be suspended till the next annual communication of Grand Lodge, and that a committee be appointed to visit Nauvoo, make a thorough examination, and report its findings to Grand Lodge at its next annual communication. The minority report partook somewhat of the character of a Scotch verdict. The evidence submitted had failed to establish any irregularities, but fearing that such irregularities could be shown, the third member of the committee joined his colleagues in the recommendation mode. A substitute report prevailed which provided for the appointment of a special committee whose duty it should be to proceed at once to Nauvoo, make the investigation contemplated, and report results to the Grand Master. He in turn was authorized to remove the injunction suspending labor, or to continue it, as the facts presented by the committee might warrant. This committee entered at once upon the task assigned, and in due time reported its findings to the Grand Master. Investigation showed that grave irregularities had obtained in the work of the lodge, and that these were of such character as to strike at once at the vital principles of our order. Among others, the committee specified the practice of balloting for several candidates at one and the same time, and a tendency to make a reformatory of the judge. In review of the whole situation, while the committee found much to regret and much to deplore, it was of the opinion that the case did not demand that the injunction suspending labor should be made perpetual, and therefore recommended that the lodge be permitted to resume its work till the next annual communication of Grand Lodge, and that some members of the craft should be appointed to visit Nauvoo for the purpose of reminding the brethren of the irregularities complained of and admonish them to avoid the same in the future. In accordance with this recommendation, Grand Master Helm on November 2nd, 1842, issued his order which permitted the lodge to resume labor. From such evidence as is at hand, that the Nauvoo brethren lost no time in getting to work, and the results of their efforts were certainly remarkable. During the 11 months immediately following the restoration of their dispensation, they were so successful in the work of increasing their numbers, that dispensations for 2 additional lodges in Nauvoo were granted, and the Grand Master in his address to the Grand Lodge recommended that, before the charter requested should issue to Nauvoo Lodge, its membership should be divided into 4 or more distinct lodges. That conditions in Nauvoo had not passed unobserved by the craft of the state is abundantly shown by the Grand Master's address just referred to, which was presented to Grand Lodge October 3rd, 1843. Speaking of the subject in general, he tells Grand Lodge that it has excited no little discussion both in and out of this body, and the action of the Grand Lodge in reference to it has been made the object of much animadversion, criticism, and remark. Several communications from eminent and honored names in Masonry have been addressed to me, calling in question the correctness of the course pursued by you in relation to this subject, and strongly protesting against the prudence and propriety of allowing a Masonic lodge to exist in Nauvoo. In due time the whole matter came into the hands of the Committee on Returns and Work. A preliminary report by this committee declares that it had examined the abstract returns of the 3 Nauvoo lodges, viz., Nauvoo, Nye, and Helm, and found itself unable to complete its work until further explanation and amendment of the returns had been made. On the evening of the next day, however, the committee made an extended report, in which it reviewed the situation in all 5 of the Mormon lodges. There were 3 in Nauvoo, 1 in Keokuk, UD, and 1, Rising Sun No. 12, at Montrose. The last 2 were in Iowa Territory, and Rising Sun had already received its charter. The committee found that the work of Rising Sun Lodge No. 12 was irregular. that its returns were informal, and its dues had not been paid. The work of Nauvoo Lodge had been mainly correct, but there were irregularities which the committee could not understand, in view of what had already taken place. The records of the lodge had not been submitted as required by law. Members of more than doubtful character had been accepted, and there appeared to be more than a tendency to push candidates on through the second and third degrees without reference to their proficiency in the preceding degree. Helm Lodge had been guilty of irregular work, and had rushed applicants through without regard to time between the degrees. It had passed and raised candidates within 2 days of initiation. Nye Lodge had also done irregular work, in that it had received petitions for the degrees on one day and initiated petitioners on the next. The committee found itself in a quandary as to what it should suggest with reference to Nye and Keokuk lodges. Finally, after having considered all available evidence, the committee recommended that the charter of Rising Sun Lodge No. 12 should be suspended, and the officers cited to appear before Grand Lodge and show cause why that instrument should not be revoked; that it be declared inexpedient longer to continue a Masonic lodge at Nauvoo, and for the disrespect and contempt of Nauvoo and Helm lodges, in refusing to present their records to Grand Lodge, their dispensations be revoked and charters refused; that for irregular work and disregard of Grand Lodge instructions and resolutions, the dispensations of Keokuk and Nye lodges be revoked and charters refused. The recommendations, the substance of which is given here, were adopted by Grand Lodge. Near the close of this session of Grand Lodge, a set of resolutions was adopted which included one requiring the possession of a certificate of good standing, signed by the Grand Master and attested by the Grand Secretary of the jurisdiction whence a stranger brother hailed, before he could be admitted as a visitor or receive Masonic charity in Illinois. A recent writer affirms that this was done to prevent members of Mormon judges from visiting regular bodies in that state. Such may have been the case, but there is no evidence available to the writer in support of this claim. On the contrary, the statement is made that this resolution was presented in accordance with the suggestion of the Grand Master in his address, who there declares that the idea came from the Washington and later the Baltimore conventions. Thus matters stood at the close of the Grand Lodge communication of 1843. But succeeding events showed conclusively that it is one thing to pass resolutions, and quite another to secure recognition and obedience thereto. The records show that soon after the close of Grand Lodge, the Grand Master dispatched a member to Nauvoo to demand the dispensations and records of the 3 lodges located there; that this request was denied; that the representative of the Grand Master was treated with contempt, and that he was informed that the lodges proposed to continue doing Masonic work. While the evidence showing that this purpose was carried out is not extensive, it is sufficient. On April 1st, 1844, Bodley Lodge No. 1, after discussing the situation, directed its secretary to notify the Grand Master that the lodges in Nauvoo and Keokuk continued to work, and that notice had appeared in public print that the lodges of Nauvoo would dedicate their Masonic hall in that place on April 5th, the members of those lodges claiming that they had received no notice of the action of Grand Lodge withdrawing their dispensations. From the journal of Joseph Smith we get certain interesting details of the exercises connected with the dedication of the Masonic hall. He tells us under date of Friday, April 5th, that he attended the ceremonies, that about 550 Masons from various parts of the world were present and took part, that a procession was formed, which was accompanied by the Nauvoo brass band, that the exercises were in charge of Hiram Smith, worshipful master, that the principal address of the occasion was given by Apostle Erastus Snow, that he, Joseph Smith, and Dr. Goforth had addressed the assembly, that all the visiting Masons were given dinner in the Masonic hall at the expense of the Nauvoo Lodge. An echo of the exercises held in connection with the dedication of the Masonic hall at Nauvoo is found in the action taken by the lodge at Belleville, St. Clair, No. 24. It seems that this lodge disciplined one of its members for marching in the procession referred to above, the position taken that such an act was a participation in the work of a clandestine lodge. The record is not clear on the point, but suggests at least that later action taken by Grand Lodge grew out of this case of discipline, and is of importance in connection with our subject, since it determines the status of members of lodges from which authority to work had been withdrawn. Grand Lodge went on record as holding that, it is imperative on all good Masons to regard all who participate in a subordinate lodge that has been suspended or declared clandestine by this Grand Lodge as clandestine Masons, and therefore unworthy of our Masonic association. As may readily be seen from this, all the members of the 5 Mormon lodges were clandestine from the date of the adoption of the resolutions which provided for revoking the charter of the Rising Sun Lodge No. 12 and the dispensations of the other 4 lodges, viz., October 3rd, 1842, though not declared to be such till later. There is one other bit of evidence that unmistakably shows that the Nauvoo lodges continued to work after their dispensations had been withdrawn. This is found in the journal of Joseph Smith. Under date of Tuesday, April 30th, less than 2 months prior to the death of the prophet, we find this: a complaint was commenced against William and Wilson Law in the Masonic Lodge, etc. So matters stood with reference to the recalcitrant lodges till Grand Lodge met October 7th, 1844. At that session more drastic action was taken. A brief statement of the facts in the case was followed by resolutions which declared that all fellowship with those lodges was withdrawn, that the members thereof were clandestine, that all who hailed therefrom were suspended from all the privileges of Masonry with the jurisdiction of Illinois, and that the Grand Lodges of other jurisdictions be requested to deny them the same privileges. Another resolution directed the Grand Secretary to notify all Grand Lodges with which the Grand Lodge of Illinois was in correspondence of the facts, and to publish the same in all the Masonic periodicals. This terminated the official connection of the Grand Lodge of Illinois with the Masonry of Nauvoo. Records of action taken with reference to the lodges at Warsaw and Keokuk are to be found in the proceedings for the years 1845 and 1846, but these are of no special interest to us in this connection. The story of the last few months of the life of the Mormon prophet is an exceedingly interesting one to the student of the period. This does not mean as biography simply that in connection with and as a part of the story of his people with which it is inextricably woven. We would be drawn too far afield from the purpose of this paper should time be given to the details of that story, but time must be taken for such a hasty glance at succeeding events as is necessary to round out this part of our study. With the advent of spring 1844, events moved rapidly toward the fatal culmination in Carthage jail. Early in May, the prospectus of the Nauvoo expositor made its appearance, and a month later, Friday, June 7th, the initial and only number of that publication issued from the press. This paper was promoted and published by Emmons, Wilson, and William Law, the Hayes, Fosters, and others, all of whom had been prominent in the councils of the church, but who, while still claiming to be Mormons, objected to what they considered a one-man power, and to some of the doctrines which had been promulgated by the prophet, more particularly that of a plurality of wives. The expositor was to be the organ of this dissenting party, through which these men hoped to bring about certain changes and reforms, including the repeal of the Nauvoo charter, which in their judgment placed too much and exceedingly dangerous power in the hands of the head of the church, the city council, and municipal court. As noted above, the first number of the expositor came out on Friday, June 7th. The prospectus, issued a month before, had aroused great excitement in Nauvoo, and proceedings of one sort or other had been set on foot against the publishers. But the paper itself seemed to sweep the people, and more especially the authorities, off their feet. On Saturday, the 8th, the city council met and gave most of the day to a consideration of the situation, and to taking testimony as to the standing and character of the men who had thrown this firebrand into their midst. No decision was reached on that day, and the council adjourned to meet on the following Monday, June 10th. Upon coming together at the appointed hour on Monday, the discussion was renewed. From the first, Joseph Smith, who was mayor, spoke in favor of the destruction of the printing plant whence had come the obnoxious sheet, and repeatedly urged the council to pass an ordinance under which it could be declared a nuisance and be destroyed. When action on the proposed ordinance was finally had, it was found that but one member of the council was opposed to it, and he was not a member of the church. He suggested that a heavy fine should be imposed, naming $3,000 as the amount. However, this advice was not heeded. An ordinance was framed to meet the case and passed, and a resolution followed which declared the expositor a nuisance, and instructed the mayor to cause said printing establishment and papers to be removed without delay in such manner as he shall direct. The mayor's order to the city marshal was issued immediately, in which that official was directed to destroy the press, pie the type, burn any of the expositors that might be found, and authorizing him to demolish the building should resistance be offered by the proprietors of the paper. This order was executed on the evening of the same day, June 10th. The project of publishing an opposition paper in Nauvoo had come to a sudden end, but not so with the troubles of the prophet and his people. The destruction of the expositor under the circumstances was about the worst thing that could have happened to Joseph Smith and his followers, and it was the match applied to the magazine. 2 days after the destruction of the printing plant, warrants were secured by the owners of the paper for the arrest of Joseph Smith and the members of the city council on a charge of riot. When the mayor was arrested, he immediately applied to the municipal court for a writ of habeas corpus, which was granted, and he was brought before that court for trial. After examination he was released, and the costs of the case were assessed against the proprietors of the expositor. The same course was pursued when members of the council were arrested, with this difference that the mayor presided over the court, sitting as chief justice. In each of these cases the accused were discharged and the costs were taxed against the complainants. As was to be expected, these proceedings in no way allayed the excitement or lessened the force of the opposition which had arisen against the prophet and his adherents. Mass meetings were held in various communities in the country. Inflammatory speeches were freely indulged in, and active preparations were made to use force if necessary to bring about the arrest of Joseph Smith and his colleagues. Before the storm which he had so ill-advisedly invoked, the prophet appears to have quailed, and he began to make preparations to seek safety in flight. During the night of June 22nd, he and his brother Hiram, with 2 or 3 others, were rowed across the Mississippi in a leaky skiff, and the next morning O.P. Rockwell was sent back to Nauvoo to secure horses for the 2 men. In the meantime, however, pressure was brought to bear upon Joseph Smith to induce him to return to Nauvoo and give himself up, and when Rockwell came back with a message from the prophet's wife Emma to the same effect, he decided to acquiesce. Several of his companions went so far as to accuse him of cowardice for wishing to leave his people in such straits. The party finally returned to the east side of the river on the night of the 23rd. 2 days later, Joseph and Hiram were arrested on a charge of treason for having called out the Nauvoo Legion, were taken to Carthage jail, where on the afternoon of the 27th of June they were murdered by a mob. End of chapter 2, read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 3 of Mormonism and Masonry by Samuel Goodwin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Temple Ceremonies, Symbols and Language, a Study in Resemblances. Having thus traced the variegated fortunes of the Masonic lodges at Nauvoo, we are now prepared to enter upon another phase of our subject, a study in resemblances. As already intimated, the question is often asked, does the Mormon Church make use of Masonic ceremonies in its temple ritual? In what follows, for obvious reasons, no attempt will be made to give a categorical answer to this question, nor is it the purpose of the writer to point out or label any resemblances that may be discovered in the course of the study. Facts, so far as they have come to the writer's knowledge, will be presented. The reader must draw his own conclusions. The observant craftsman can not be long among the Mormon people without noting the not infrequent use made of certain emblems and symbols which have come to be associated in the public mind with the Masonic fraternity. And now and then he will catch expressions and phrases in conversation and literature which are suggestive, to say the least. If he should continue his residence in Utah, he will sometimes be made aware of the fact, when shaking hands with a Mormon neighbor or friend, that there is a pressure of the hand as though some sort of a grip is being given. Visitors and residents of Utah often remark upon the extensive use made of certain emblems, as, for example, the conventional beehive. This familiar figure occupies the center of the Great Seal of the state. A model of immense size rises from the roof of the beautiful Hotel Utah, and one of the smaller proportions crowns the platform on the cupola of the Beehive House, the official residence of the president of the church. It is noticeably prominent on the great bronze doors which guard the entrance to the sacred precincts of the Salt Lake Temple, as well as on doors of commercial and other buildings. It is placed on the tops of newel posts of the cement steps which lead to the entrance of meeting houses and tabernacles, and frequently appears with effect in the decorative schemes of interiors, as in the lobby of Hotel Utah. Other symbols with which the public is more or less familiar are used extensively, more especially in and about the Salt Lake Temple, and presumably in all other temples of the Mormon Church. On the interior of this building we learn from an unquestioned authority. There are in the walls several series of stories of emblematical designs and significance, representing the earth, moon, sun, and stars. On the east center tower is an inscriptive, the letters deep cut, lined with gold, which reads, "Holiness to the Lord." This inscription, it might be noted, appears over the doorway of some of the business establishments conducted by the church, and over the entrance to the church tithing house, and it is given place on the stationery used in the official correspondence conducted by church authorities. Immediately beneath this inscription, over the central casement of the east tower of the temple, is the emblem of the clasped hands. On the corresponding stones above the upper windows in each of the central towers is carved the all-seeing eye. Covering the plate glass double doors on the east and west sides of the temple, each of which is 4 by 12 feet, are bronze grills of intricate patterns which carry medallions of the beehive, while an escutcheon cut in relief shows the clasped hands circled by a wreath. In the garden room of the temple, the ceiling is embellished with oil paintings to represent clouds and the sky, in which appear the sun, moon, and stars. In the center of this room and against the south wall is a platform which is reached by 3 steps. On the platform is an altar upon which rests the Bible. In the terrestrial room at the east end is a raised floor reached by 3 steps. Passing now from this phase of the subject, we come next to the language used in a part of the temple ceremonies. Here we are dependent for authorities, mainly upon certain exposés, though collateral evidence is not wanting. The exposés referred to are 3 in number, and they are separated from each other in time by almost a generation. A comparison of the 3 accounts shows that the first or oldest one differs from the other 2 or later ones in one significant particular at least. From the Van Dusen account, it appears that in the Nauvoo temple use was made of a larger number of stages or degrees in these ceremonies than was the case later, and that these extended to and included the 7th. This fact seems to point to the conclusion that the work was in a preliminary or experimental stage in Nauvoo, and that later it was developed and perfected into its present form, which included the practical omission of the last 4 degrees. A well-informed member of the Mormon Church, in conversation with the writer, accounted for the character of the Van Dusen statements upon a different supposition, though upon what authority was not disclosed. He said that Van Dusen was a liar, and further that he was a Mason. It may very well have been that he was a Mason, although no records are known to the writer which support that claim. As will be shown later, the followers of Joseph Smith believed that the temple ceremonies were revealed to the prophet complete, and more than a year before he became a Mason, and that proof of this is to be found in the Doctrine and Covenants. As a preliminary to a consideration of some of the language of the temple ritual, it may not be amiss to note certain objects and articles used in connection with that ritual. The garments worn by both men and women during a goodly portion of the ceremonies are of white cloth and of the one-piece pattern. On the right breast is a square, and on the left compasses. There are other marks or openings which are of no special interest to us here. As used in the temple at Nauvoo, the slits representing a pair of compasses were on the knees rather than on the left breast. The pattern of this garment, the wearer is informed, was revealed to Joseph Smith direct from heaven, and in the same as that worn by Adam and Eve. At one point in the ceremonies, the devil comes in wearing a silk hat and having on a Masonic apron. This apron is embellished with two columns with a serpent suspended midway between, and a serpent entwined about the base of each. The aprons worn by the men and women are alike, and are described as being a square half yard of green silk, with 9 fig leaves worked on them in brown sewing silk. Those in use at Nauvoo were of white cloth about 18 inches square, with green silk leaves pasted on. In the old Endowment House at Salt Lake, the ceiling of the Garden of Eden room was painted much of the same as that described above, with these additions. In each corner there was a Masonic emblem, in one compasses, in another a square, and in the other two a level and a plumb. The opening part of the temple ceremonies, which have been characterized by a Mormon writer as the Masonic sacred drama of the fall of man, need not detain us. Here occurs the washings and anointings and assumption of the garment before referred to, and a representation in dialogue of the creation of the world and woman. Following this preparatory part, the first obligation or oath is taken. One of the several couples kneels at the altar to represent Adam and Eve, and all participate in the ceremonies. The audience stands with the right hand raised to a square when the following oath is taken. We and each of us solemnly bind ourselves that we will not reveal any of the secrets of the first token of the Aaronic priesthood, with its accompanying name, sign, or penalty. So I do so. I agree that my throat may be cut from ear to ear, and my tongue torn out by its roots. Grip. The grip is very simple. Hands clasped, pressing the point of the knuckles of the index finger with the thumb. Sign. In executing the signs of the penalty, the hand palm down is placed across the body, so that the thumb comes directly under and a little behind the ear. The hand is drawn sharply to the right across the throat, the elbow standing out at a position of 90 degrees from the body. The hand is dropped from the square to the side. In the earliest form of these ceremonies, as used in Nauvoo in 1846, this obligation, or a part of it at least, appears to have been given in what was termed the 6th degree. The exercises then proceed. Various characters appear and carry on a dialogue, and then a robe and sandals are put on the candidates, and the apron replaced, and the second oath is administered. We and each of us do solemnly promise and bind ourselves never to reveal any of the secrets of this priesthood, with the accompanying name, grip, and penalty. Should we do so, we agree that our breasts may be torn open, our heart and vitals torn out and given to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Grip. Clasp the right hand and place the thumb into the hollow of the knuckles between the first and second fingers. Sign. The sign is made by extending the right hand across the left breast directly over the heart, then drawing it rapidly from left to right with the elbow at the square, then dropping the hand to the side. The candidates are then conducted into what is known as the celestial room. Here also characters appear and carry on conversation relating to the ceremonies, and other preparations are made for the administering of the third oath, which is as follows. You and each of you do covenant and promise that you will never reveal any of the secrets of the priesthood, with any accompanying name, sign, and penalty. Should you do so, you agree that your body may be cut asunder, and all your bowels gush out. In this, the left hand is placed palm upright, directly in front of the body, there being a right angle formed at the elbow. The right hand, palm down, is placed under the elbow of the left, then drawn sharply across the bowels, and both hands dropped to the side. The grip is given by grasping the right hands so that the little fingers are interlocked, and the forefinger presses the wrist. This is known as the patriarchal grip, or the true sign of the nail. The neophytes are then ready for the threefold obligation which relates to the law of sacrifice, the law of chastity, and the law of vengeance. The last named law, it might be noted in passing, is given, with but slight variation, by all three of the authorities quoted here. The character of the second law is indicated by its title, and is not without significance, though it need not detain us. Following these obligations, the candidates are seated and a long sermon or lecture is given, in which the entire history of the temple work is rehearsed. They are then instructed in the true order of prayer. In this, when all is in readiness, the elder kneels at the altar, his right arm raised to the square, his left hand extended as if to receive a blessing. A form of prayer is then offered, which, it is said, is used in all priesthood meetings. The candidates are then ready to pass through the veil. In the veil are to be seen the square and compasses, also other openings which represent the slits in the knees of every garment. In the room where this veil is there is also a platform upon which the candidates take seats when their names are called, and which is ascended by 3 steps. With the aid of an attendant, the neophyte gives the required answers in grips, which include the 2 grips of the Aaronic priesthood and the 2 grips of the Melchizedek priesthood. Following the last grip, a dialogue ensues. Elohim: what is this? Neophyte: the 2nd grip of the Melchizedek priesthood, patriarchal grip, or sure sign of the nail. Elohim: has it a name? Neophyte: it has. Elohim: will you give it to me? Neophyte: I cannot, for I have not yet received it. For this purpose I have come to converse with the Lord behind the veil. Elohim: you shall receive it upon the 5 points of fellowship through the veil. These are foot to foot, knee to knee, breast to breast, hand to back, and mouth to ear. We may here take leave of the temple ceremonies, but there are certain other matters derived from a different source that have a significance for us. First is language used by a brilliant writer of the Mormon faith. In a chapter that deals with the Logan temple at Logan, Utah, the author contrasts the views of this structure held by Latter-day Saints and Gentiles, and then proceeds: to the Mormons the Logan temple is a grand Masonic fabric, reared unto the name of the God of Israel, where endowments are given, and ordinances administered, and services performed which concern salvation and exaltation both of the living and the dead, and connected with the Mormon church. After referring to a supposed polygamic theocracy, which he says is popularly supposed by non-Mormons to exist in the Logan temple, the author continues: and what makes this matter of so much importance and interest is that the Logan temple today is looked upon as the Masonic embodiment of the polygamic theocracy. The above is followed by a paragraph that deals with several more particularly 2 exposés of the endowment house secrets. Then the author says: meantime the Mormon apostles and elders, with a becoming repugnance and Masonic reticence quite understandable to members of every Masonic order, have shrank from a public exhibition of the sacred things of their temple. When describing certain scenes enacted in the endowment ceremonies, he refers to the Garden of Eden representation as the Masonic sacred drama of the fall of man; and again, a sign, a grip, and a keyword were communicated and impressed upon us, and the 3rd degree of Mormon endowment, or the 1st degree of the Aaronic priesthood, was conferred. And finally, our author refers to the oath of chastity, alluded to above, and marks with special emphasis the fact that the oath implies that no man dare, under penalty of death, to betray his brother's wife or daughter. Perhaps the most significant utterance bearing on the subject that has come from one who is in a position to know whereof he speaks is that which comes from a member of the present quorum of the 12 apostles. In an address delivered in the Salt Lake Tabernacle on the last Sunday of 1919, as reported in one of the daily papers, the speaker said: modern Masonry is a fragmentary presentation of the ancient order established by King Solomon, from whom it is said to have been handed down through the centuries. Frequent assertion that some details of the Mormon temple ordinances resemble Masonic rites led him to refer to the subject. The speaker declared, and he added, that he was not sorry there was such a similarity, because of the fact that the ordinances and rites revealed to Joseph Smith constituted a reintroduction upon the earth of the divine plan inaugurated in the Temple of Solomon in ancient days. Plans for the ordinances to be observed in the temple built at Nauvoo were revealed to Joseph Smith as recorded in the Doctrine and Covenants, more than a year prior to the time the founder of the Mormon Church became a member of the Masonic order. The latter order, the speaker affirmed, claimed origin with King Solomon, but through lapses and departures which had naturally come into the order in the course of time, it had fallen somewhat into imperfection of detail. The temple plan revealed to Joseph Smith was the perfect Solomonic plan, under which no man was permitted to obtain the secrets of Masonry unless he also held the holy priesthood. The speaker then explained the authentic proof in Masonic history went to show that the 5 lodges of the order established by Joseph Smith and other members of the Mormon Church had been discountenanced by the great organization through mistaken non-observance of a mere technicality. The Mormon lodges, Apostle Ballard declared, had been accepting and advancing members in the order by viva voce vote, instead of by secret ballot, as the rule required. But, he said, The technical offence had been seized upon as a cause for repudiating the lodges established by members of an unpopular church. It is not our purpose to examine critically any of the assertions made by the speaker. Enough has been said in the preceding pages, and more evidence could be adduced to show that the action of the Grand Lodge of Illinois with reference to the Mormon lodges was due to other causes than the ones specified by the speaker quoted. Further, no objections will be urged here to the acceptance on the part of any one of the statement that the temple ritual parts of which have been presented in these pages was revealed to Joseph Smith or to any one else direct from heaven. The writer will only say that no evidence has come to his knowledge which points to any such supernatural derivation. It is worthy of mention in this connection that the prophet records the fact that on the 4th day of May, 1842, he instructed certain of his followers in the principles and order of the priesthood attending to washing, anointings, endowments, and the communication of keys pertaining to the Aaronic priesthood, and so on to the highest order of the Melchizedek priesthood, setting forth the order pertaining to the Ancient of Days, and that in this council was instigated the ancient order of things for the first time in these last days. This, of course, does not preclude the possibility of the revelation of this order having been received much earlier than the date given, as is held by the historian of the church. End of chapter 3, read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Of the Mormon Church. Chapter 4 of Mormonism and Masonry by Samuel Goodwin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Chapter 4 of Mormonism and Masonry by Samuel Goodwin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. From a different angle, some of the significant teachings of Mormonism. Under any circumstances, great care should be exercised in the selection of material for membership in Masonic lodges. This holds true everywhere and at all times, and is a duty that in an especial sense devolves upon those who in a representative capacity first pass upon the qualifications of applicants for our mysteries in Utah. A number of reasons for this might be given, some of which it is the purpose of this chapter to set forth. In a general way, it may be said that the historic, well-known, and consistent position held by the craft of this jurisdiction, practically, from the very inception of organized Masonry, back in '65, to the present time, furnishes one reason for caution on the part of Utah investigating committees. Further, there is a noticeable tendency on the part of some who are young in Masonry, and of others who, though older, are inclined to be lenient toward a relaxation of requirements, to take account only of the superficial, and to base their conclusions upon an imperfect apprehension of facts which cannot be ignored with safety. In what follows, attention is directed to certain facts, no one of which, perhaps taken alone, may seem to be of any great consequence, but which in the aggregate are worthy of serious consideration. In seeking to attain the object in view, we may pass boundaries which somehow have acquired a pseudo-sanctity, and find ourselves in fields too rarely entered by those who, for the time being, are charged with the duty of guarding well our outer portals. That there may be no uncertainty as to what is here undertaken, it may be stated that we are dealing with the general subject of Mormonism and Masonry, and that the particular phase of the subject upon which we now enter relates itself to any would-be applicant who at the same time is a member of the Latter-day Saint organization. Masonry requires of its initiates, among other things, that they shall come of their own free will and accord. By implication, principle, and teaching, it assumes that those who come into its fellowship are and will remain free from any influence or agency that might interfere with the performance of such duties as may devolve upon them. With this in view, the petitioner is required to declare that he is not a member of any organization whose rules are incompatible with membership in the fraternity. This is not done in criticism of any organization that curtails the freedom of thought or action of its adherents. Such criticism does not lie within the province of Masonry. But Masonry, like any other organization, does claim and exercise the right to erect such standards as may seem to be necessary, to fix upon and apply tests, to pass upon the qualifications of would be members, and to decide in any and every case whether the requirements can be or have been satisfactorily met. In the exercise of these, as of all other functions, Masonry is a law unto itself. With the ground thus clear, we may proceed to the consideration of certain facts, the bearing and significance of which can hardly be mistaken. If we do not mistake the meaning of the words of those who are authorized to speak, the LDS organization makes such demands upon those who accept its principles and leadership as to produce results which do not accord with the genius of Freemasonry. For example, great stress is laid upon the authority and power of the priesthood. We are told that a man may not honestly differ from the presiding priesthood without being guilty of apostasy and subject to excommunication. This principle was declared in no uncertain phrase by Brigham Young and George Q. Cannon, and in effect it has frequently been set forth since. Said Cannon on one occasion, when Brigham Young was present, "It is apostasy to differ honestly with the measures of the President. A man may be honest even in hell." And President Wells, on the same occasion, declared in no less unmistakable terms that one might as well ask the question whether a man had the right to differ honestly with the Almighty. Presumably, these rather startling assertions rest upon the doctrine frequently promulgated that the President of the Church is the very mouthpiece of God, his vicegerent on earth, and the sole channel through which he communicates his will and purpose concerning all that pertains to his kingdom on earth. Illustrations of the practical application of the principle under consideration are not wanting, and those furnish convincing proof of the vitality of the doctrine. W. S. Godbey and his colleagues were cut off from the Church because they presumed to deny the right of Brigham Young to restrict freedom of thought and speech or to discipline them for opinion's sake, and because they did not accept his financial policy. Moses Thatcher held opinions concerning his rights and privileges as an American citizen which did not accord with those of the first presidency, and the other members of the quorum of apostles and he declined to take counsel and was disfellowshipped for his temerity. Small White felt that the president of the church should not enter the commercial field in competition with persons less highly placed, and he gave voice to his opinion to his bishop and was cut off from the church. B. H. Roberts, noting an unmistakable partiality in the application of a church rule in the interest of one political party and against the other, entered politics without the approval of the church authorities and was made to feel the sting of their displeasure, but later was reconciled with his brethren. Roberts, who is perhaps the brainiest man in the church, as he is the most independent thinker and most prolific writer, recently gave frank expression in a conference address to his belief that the Mormon people had not always been blameless, that their conduct had not always been defensible, that on the part of some individuals narrowness and fanaticism and bigotry and unwisdom had been exhibited, that the disasters which overtook the followers of the prophet in Missouri were due in part at least to boastfulness, overzeal, fanaticism, and unwisdom on the part of the people, and that, in his early experience, even the prophet Joseph Smith made his mistakes and was several times reproved of the Lord because of them. For this frank avowal of facts of the truth of which his historical studies had convinced him, he was taken sharply to task in the same session of the conference by the president of the church, Joseph F. Smith. Such results as are here indicated need occasion no surprise, for it must be remembered that the authorities, the priesthood, are in very deed a part of God, and as such they can fix irrevocably the ultimate status of man, for to them belong the power to bind on earth that which shall be bound in heaven, and to loose on earth that which shall be loosed in heaven, to remit sin, to say what shall be done and how it shall be done and on what occasions it shall be done. And when the president of the church speaks anything as the mind and will of the Lord, it is just as binding upon us as if God spake personally to us. Those who are at all familiar with the teachings and literature of the Mormon Church need no proof of the necessity of absolute obedience to the priesthood on the part of adherents, or of the insistence upon this from the beginning to the present. As already indicated, Denial of this principle was one of the chief offenses of those who were responsible for the Utah schism. It has been argued that we must passively and uninquiringly obey the priesthood because otherwise we could not build Zion, complained E.L.T. Harrison in an appeal to the people and a protest, and such obedience appears to be required in all the relations of life, in things spiritual and temporal. Some of us who are unacquainted with the refinements, or modifications, or qualifications to which such teachings may be subjected in their applications to individual cases may well be pardoned if we question whether a member of an organization which makes such unusual demands is, or really can be, in a position to act freely in determining what course shall be pursued. And if he is not really free in this particular, could he, being so circumstanced, be considered good material for our rights? Could he answer honestly and satisfactorily that question in our petition to which reference has already been made? We are familiar with the fact that leaders of the LDS organization have repeatedly declared that their followers are as free to act in all the affairs of life as are the votaries of any other faith or philosophy of life. But when issues of the most vital concern, having to do with time and eternity, are made to hinge absolutely upon acceptance of this fundamental principle, we are forced to confess that such assertions make an unwarranted and impossible demand upon our credulity. Another set of facts which cannot or ought not to be ignored in this study has to do with the matter of polygamy. The writer appreciates the fact that by many this is regarded as a dead issue. He is mindful of the further fact that a manifesto was issued by the president of the church in 1890, which advised the people to refrain from the practice of this principle, and that later this famous document was construed as prohibiting not only new marriages, but also those who had previously entered this relation from living with their plural wives. It is to be remembered, too, that the present head of the church recently declared, with so much earnestness, that he afterwards apologized for the manner in which he had spoken, having been, as he expressed himself, gloriously mad, that no man on earth had the power to perform plural marriages, and we have excommunicated 2 patriarchs who have pretended to perform plural marriages. All this and these, for reasons that follow, do not remove the subject beyond the purview of the Mason or the Lodge that may be seeking information as to the fitness of material to come into our fellowship. It is conceded that this subject does not have the importance of the Mason and Citizen that it had when Grand Secretary Deal sent out his circular in which he set forth the position of the Grand Lodge of Utah with reference to the Latter-day Saints, their teachings and practices. But after all allowances have been made, there still remain considerations that are pertinent to our purpose. At all events, such is the conviction of the writer. He is not convinced that this subject is a dead issue, for he recalls the fact that a president of the church, the very mouthpiece of God, as we have seen, declared concerning this practice and doctrine, "It is one of the most vital parts of our religious faith. It emanated from God and cannot be legislated away. Take this from us, and you rob us of our hopes and associations in the resurrection." And hardly less pertinent is the fact that this principle, like the revelation which established it, still holds its place in the teachings, beliefs, and literature of the Mormon people. The uninitiated may experience some difficulty, perhaps when they undertake to reconcile one set of facts with another set of facts which appear to be at the opposite pole. This is the situation. It is known that the practice of polygamy has been abandoned, according to repeated statements made by those who are in authority, and that this principle is no longer taught by the church. Yet it is a matter of common knowledge that the present head of the organization is a polygamist, as also was his immediate predecessor in that position, and all who preceded him. At least such was his status at the time of the Smoot investigation, when he was a fugitive from justice, on account of his marital relations. There are other leaders associated with the president of the church who are similarly situated. These men are the leaders of the thought and exemplars of the principles of the organization, and are living their religion. This is referred to here, not in any spirit of criticism, but for the purpose of calling attention to the teaching value of such facts. "Your actions speak so loud that I cannot hear what you say," is an adage which is not without suggestiveness in this connection. The influence of the first presidency, and more particularly of the president of the church, is greater than that of any other man or set of men. How could it be otherwise in view of his alleged relationship to deity, and of the great and unusual powers he exercises by virtue of that relationship? It must follow that the words, the actions, the daily life of one vested with such singular prerogatives exert a tremendous influence in the direction of shaping opinion and belief, of determining the attitude of multitudes of people towards the institutions and the laws of the land, in fact, of making the individual what he is. For a man or for men so placed to take the position for any considerable length of time, that a law with which they do not find themselves in accord is unconstitutional and therefore is to be ignored, as was done for nearly 2 decades, or to insist that the practice of polygamy is ordained of God, is ecclesiastical in its nature and government, and because of this, it is therefore outside of constitutional law, and so, being within the pale of the church, its free exercise cannot be prohibited. Or again, for the vicegerent of God to testify in the most conspicuous manner, though not of his own free will and accord, that he had been, and was then, living in known violation of the laws of his country, his church, and his God, that he expected to continue so doing, and that he was willing to take his chances with the laws of the state, and for other leaders only a little less prominent than the president to testify to the same conditions in their marital relations. For such a situation to develop and exist, and to be taken as a sort of matter of course, or even approved and commended by so large a body of people, cannot be productive of results that are far from being reassuring. How can it be otherwise than that such attitude toward law, and such examples on the part of such influential men, should have a powerful effect upon the young manhood and womanhood of the LDS organizations? We are of the opinion that it is not desirable, certainly. It is not in accord with Masonic ideals and teachings, to subject young people to character-forming influences which must tend to make them indifferent to law. Many thoughtful craftsmen earnestly believe that these are times in which regard for law should be emphasized on all suitable occasions, and that the too general practice, in effect, of nullifying and repealing law by individual disregard of law, instead of making use of the means provided by law, is a proceeding dangerous beyond calculation, a positive, subtle menace to the very foundation of those institutions which are at once our boast and our fetish. Another angle of this phase of our subject should not be overlooked. Not only is the doctrine taught by example, and that by the most influential men in the LDS organization, but it appears in the literature and often in the instructions given the people. The Doctrine and Covenants is one of the 4 standard works adapted by formal actions of this organization. It is the Word of God and is of equal authority with the Bible, the Book of Mormon, and the Pearl of Great Price. Sometimes LDS controversialists have strenuously objected when their opponents have quoted statements made by conference speakers in place of adhering strictly to these standard works of the Church. Now, as noted above, the Doctrines and Covenants is authoritative and standard. Section or chapter 132 of this book records the revelation on plural marriage. If it ever taught this principle, and there is no controversy on this score, it still teaches it. For the late president of the Church, Joseph F. Smith, testified under oath that it had not been annulled or repealed, and so far as known to the writer, no action of this sort has ever been taken. It is still part and parcel of the authoritative teachings of the Church, as also is the rather severe sentence which it pronounces upon those who fail to accept this teaching. In the material provided for study by the young people's organizations of the Church, considerable stress is laid upon the lives of Joseph and Hiram Smith, Brigham Young, and others of the leading men in the history of this people, all of whom lived their religion. These men are held up as heroic characters, whose words and example are presented for instruction and emulation. Sometimes speakers, when addressing large numbers of this faith, declare their adherence to the principle under consideration. Some years after the manifesto was issued, an apostle declared that the principle of plural marriage is as true today as it ever was, and asserted that those who prevent you from obeying are responsible to God for so doing. B. H. Roberts, in a church periodical published for the guidance and instruction of young people, members of the Mutual Improvement Association, has a long article in defense of this principle. Other illustrations of the matter under consideration could easily be assembled if they were deemed necessary, but enough has been said, it would seem, to show what is being done along this line. We do not undertake to reconcile the contradictions which must be apparent to every observant craftsman. We are simply calling attention to facts. As these pages are being written in the hope that they may prove to be helpful in a measure to investigating committees, there is another point of view that should be presented here. Sometimes it is asserted with reference to one who has applied or is desirous of applying for the degrees. He does not practice polygamy, never has done so, and though a member of the LDS organization, he never has accepted it even in principle. Why isn't he good material? Such a question would seem to call for an affirmative answer, and other things being equal, to leave little room for objection. But even in such a case there are certain considerations which should have weight. And it is not any one thing, but all those matters which have to do with conduct and character, which really help to place a man, that should be laid on the scales. There is, we believe, such a thing as, for want of a better term, group responsibility. By this it is meant that a man can hardly cut himself off, relieve himself of responsibility by declining to hold to one principle at the same time he claims the privileges and accepts the benefits accruing from membership in an organization of which that very principle is fundamental. To illustrate, the writer might claim affiliation with the I.W.W., for example, but strenuously insist that, while a member of that organization and ready to aid in the promulgation of its principles and philosophy of life, he does not now and never has believed in the use of dynamite for the destruction of life and property in order to gain the ends which this particular organization has in view. Could he justly be shrived of responsibility when the organization of which he is a member uses dynamite? Perhaps in the payment of dues and assessments which among other things were necessary to keep him in good standing in the organization, his money helped to buy the dynamite used in the destruction of life. Should his protest of disbelief in a principle outweigh the practical, concrete assistance he gave to the organization which does hold to the principle he disclaims? Whether the analogy is close and satisfactory in all particulars or not, there is a suggestion here which investigating committees should not ignore when arriving at a conclusion. There is another objective, and one that at first blush would seem to be conclusive, that is sure to appear when the suggestion is made that one's belief is to be considered when passing upon the qualifications of an applicant. The impression prevails quite generally that Masonry does not assume the right to question a petitioner on the score that, in effect, he may believe what he pleases, and if all right in other respects, he may be received into our fellowship. Of course, a moment's reflection must convince us that this is not the case. We do claim, and constantly exercise, the right to demand that a man must believe certain things, or his petition will not even be presented to the lodge. It must be evident, too, to the well-informed, that the range of inquiry touching what must be accepted by applicants is not fixed by any so-called immutable landmark, for the requirements in this respect vary in different jurisdictions. Further, one can hardly follow a candidate through the ceremonies of the several degrees without noting how often, by direct question and scarcely less direct implication, the matter of belief is involved. Some years ago, a prominent leader in the LDS organization, when taken to task by critics for his avowed belief in the principle under consideration, and he was living his religion and still is doing so, responded, "Well, gentlemen, whose business is it? What are you going to do about it?" We are not prepared to say that, under the circumstances, that was not a proper and sufficient answer. But here the situation is very different. Masonry has erected certain standards to which applicants must conform, does not pass upon qualifications, necessarily must pass upon character, and in order to judge character, it is needful to know somewhat of the material, as it were, that has gone into the making of character. Hence many questions are asked, or should be, if the information is not at hand, that do not appear in our petition. And so on occasion, and when in doubt, we make inquiries concerning the habits and practices of an applicant. Circumstances might arise which would lead us to satisfy ourselves whether or not the applicant is a dope fiend or booze fighter or libertine, whether he abuses his wife or neglects his children or defrauds his creditors or is wedded to the gaming table. And we do not hesitate to satisfy ourselves as to his physical condition, whether he is crippled or defective in any respect, or is subject to ailment or disease which might bring him to be a burden upon the lodge. These intimate matters of health and character are not our business until application is made for admission to our fraternity. Then the candidate says in effect, "The bars are down, ask any questions needful, for I am desirous of meeting the conditions in order that I may be made a Mason." That one of the most powerful character-shaping influences should be excluded from consideration would be absurd, if it were required or even permitted. Our right to make such inquiries, the necessity for them appear to be beyond question. In this connection, and as further emphasizing the importance that may be attached to a state of mind, not an overt act, to a belief as a determining factor in estimating character, the decision of a Salt Lake judge in the Third District Court is illuminating and suggestive. The matter came up on the petition of an alien to become a citizen of the United States. In framing the naturalization laws under the statute, certain requirements are set forth. Failure to satisfy any one of these conditions results in defeating application for citizenship. Among other declarations required, the petitioner must state under oath that he is not a polygamist or believer in the practice of polygamy, and further he must make it appear to the satisfaction of the court that he is attached to the principles of the Constitution of the United States. In the case under consideration, the applicant for citizenship took oath as required with reference to being a polygamist and his belief in the practice of polygamy. At the hearing, however, he was interrogated with respect to fulfillment of conditions required for admission to citizenship. The testimony showed, with reference to belief in the practice of polygamy, that the petitioner based his disbelief in the practice upon the conviction, and upon no other ground, that so long as they exist, the prohibitory rules of church and state should be obeyed. He did not disbelieve in it because of any objection to the practice itself. Apart from its relationship to ecclesiastical and legal prohibitions, he does believe in it now. He was willing to obey the law and to have it obeyed, and it was shown that he did not believe in, and was unsympathetic with, the forbidding canons of both church and state. The court held that one cannot honestly believe in a practice apart from the fact that it is against the law, and at the same time be honestly attached to the law forbidding it. And further that, since his testimony shows a lack of attachment to the law against polygamy, a law fundamental to our scheme of government, he has failed to fulfill that important condition requiring petitioners to show to the satisfaction of the court that they are attached to the principles of the Constitution. Admission to citizenship was therefore denied him. The point to which attention is specially directed in this incident is the significance attached to a belief as disclosing an unfavorable attitude of mind toward the laws of the land. Masonry, like citizenship acquired through naturalization, is a privilege, not a right, and a privilege conditioned upon compliance with certain requirements, and those requirements are fixed by the written and unwritten laws of the fraternity. We pass now to another matter. Masonry directs the attention of its initiates to the Bible as God's inestimable gift to man as a rule and guide to his faith and practice. The Great Light in Anglo-Saxon Masonry occupies a prominent and well-known position in the ritual. The attitude of the LDS organization toward the Bible is not without its significance for us. The Bible is accepted as the Word of God, so far as translated correctly. The Book of Mormon is equally the Word of God, as also are the Doctrine and Covenants and Pearl of Great Price. These are the standard books of the Mormon Church. In this particular, of course, there could be no criticism, for a book of the law on the altar meets the requirements. But as we understand the matter, a fundamental teaching of the Church is what may be termed the principle of a continuous or immediate revelation. By this is meant that the president of the Church, who as we have seen is the very mouthpiece of God, may at any time substitute something better than any one of the four books named or than all of them together, and such pronouncement would be the very word of God, binding alike upon all the adherents of that faith. The whole of them, that is, the four books listed above, are not all we need. The Lord has his mouthpiece to say what shall be done, and how it shall be done, and on what occasion it shall be done. The authorities of the church are the living oracles of God, and they are worth more to the LDS than all the Bibles, all the books of Mormon, and all the books of doctrine and covenants that are written. If we could have but one of them, give me the living oracles of the priesthood for my guidance. When compared with the living oracles, declared Brigham Young, those books are nothing to me. Those books do not convey the word of God direct to us now, as do the words of the prophet or a man bearing the holy priesthood in our day and generation. I would rather have the living oracles than all the writings in the books. These words quoted by President Woodruff were spoken in the presence of Joseph Smith, who immediately arose and said, "Brother Brigham has told you the word of the Lord, and he has told you the truth." We do not call attention to these things by way of criticism. These teachings concerning the Bible, in relation to the living oracles, are for those who can, and who care to, accept them. But we do suggest that such views concern us when they are held by those who would apply to our lodges for the degrees, and who, because of the source whence such principles emanate, might feel moved at any time to substitute some man's dictum for the great light in the affairs of life. Under these circumstances, we submit that the word that might be declared by the living oracles might not accord in any particular or respect with the fundamentals of Masonry, and this might very probably be the case inasmuch as the LDS organization is opposed to all secret societies except its own. One other matter is worthy of passing notice, at least in this connection. This relates itself to deity. Masonry requires of its initiates an avowal of belief in God. It does not undertake to say what one's conception of God shall be, so that in this particular a member of the LDS organization can meet the requirements. But this fact does not preclude a consideration of conceptions so fundamental in life and character as one's apprehension of deity. Here also is disclaimed any attempt or thought of criticism. The purpose is simply to get as much light as possible upon the influences and forces and beliefs which work together in the great task of shaping character. Latter-day Saints are taught, and we assume believe in a plurality of gods. The head God organized the heavens. In the beginning, the heads of the gods organized the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, the Bible shows there is a plurality of gods beyond the power of refutation. The head of the gods appointed one God for us. The deity of the LDS is an exalted man. He has parts and passions like men, including the procreative power, which he exercises, having with him, as he sits enthroned in yonder heavens, a female deity. Whatever allowance may be made in the matter of leaving every man at liberty to conceive God as he may, this much may be said. Such a materialistic idea of God differs so widely from that held by Masons generally, but more particularly in this country, that the question might well arise whether those holding it would fit into the Masonic institution. The peace and harmony of a lodge is of prime importance. Reference has been made to the fact that the LDS organization is opposed to secret societies, and the reason for this must be clear to every well-informed, intelligent Latter-day Saint. Masonry, according to the late President Joseph F. Smith, is an institution of the evil one, as is abundantly shown by many passages in the four standard books of the Church. Now, this being true, it must follow that a member of that organization would join the fraternity in the face of these facts, would act in direct opposition to the positive declarations of church leaders and no less explicit injunctions of the four standard works of the Church, which he has accepted as the very word of his God. This being true, such a person would necessarily be a bad Mormon, and Masons may be excused for seriously doubting if a bad Mormon can make a good Mason. Now briefly to summarize the principal matters presented in the foregoing pages, so that there may be seen at a glance some of the reasons which have weight with Utah Masons today. 1. Historical attitude of the Nauvoo Masons towards Masonic customs and law. 2. Clandestinism, temple ceremonies and use of language and symbols. 3. Priesthood, unlimited power of and right to direct and dictate in all things temporal and spiritual, the mouthpiece of God. 4. Polygamy. This is taught a. in original revelations, which has not been annulled or repealed, nor can it be. b. in positive declarations of belief in it by leaders and prominent teachers. c. in the literature of the organization, and d. by the example of the leaders who live their religion. 5. Attitude toward law. Enforcement of law against polygamy was persecution, and is still so held and taught. 6. Petition. Inability of applicant honestly to answer one question in petition. 7. Great light. Substitution of living oracles, priesthood, for the Bible. 8. Deity. Conception of male and female deity out of harmony with that of Anglo-Saxon Masonry. 9. Membership prohibited. LDS organization holds Masonry to be of the evil one, and is opposed to members having any connection herewith. End of chapter 4. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. End of Mormonism and Masonry by Samuel Goodwin.